Next, we want to turn our attention to, well, a range of different issues that are all, of course, circulating around the center of gravity of the genocide in Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show to discuss this by Layan Sima Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum and also an editor at 1804 Books. Layan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, the thanks go to you. Our pleasure to have you here. I guess I'll just start with this. I mean, I'm looking at the headline at Al Jazeera right now. At least 15 killed, 30 wounded in Israeli bombing of 2 schools in Gaza. So, I mean, we have so much discussion in sort of the U.S. political sphere about the issue of a ceasefire. Is it coming? Is it coming soon? So on and so forth. But it seems to me that, honestly, the broader sort of Israeli attitude here, Layan, is to keep pushing this genocide without end. It doesn't really seem like there is any political will there to do much of anything. Am I off base?
I don't think you're off base. I mean, if we look at the timeline of events, July 24, Netanyahu came for his very controversial visit to a joint session of Congress. That visit was marred by outcry both outside the Capitol and in the weeks leading up to it, and then went back to Israel. And then quite soon after, we had 2 major assassinations of leadership in Hezbollah and Hamas. So, he came to his visit where Biden supposedly was supposed to put pressure on him kind of agreeing to finally a ceasefire deal. And instead, he turns around and goes back, and with or without the green light from the United States, we're not certain about that, but certainly the United States has not done very much to stop him, puts a major bet on the table by carrying out these very high-profile political assassinations that put the entire region at risk for an outbreak of regional war. So it certainly doesn't seem like Israel is interested in de-escalation, not interested in winding down the genocide. In the past weeks, there's been multiple bombings of schools, of so-called safe zones. The images, the reality on the ground in Gaza is just horrific from these attacks. It's not winding down in any way, shape, or form, despite the fact that Israel is still no closer to achieving any of its military goals.
So I think it's also interesting that this is all happening with this sort of backdrop of the upcoming U.S. elections. And we had, Joe Biden basically step down. He's not going to be the nominee. Now we have Kamala Harris being anointed the Democratic candidate. And there's been a lot of talk about, especially from people who are anti-genocide, that, maybe Kamala will be movable on this issue because she's, made some statements where she basically acknowledges Palestinian suffering in a way Joe Biden hasn't. But it seems pretty clear to me, at least, that as far as her policy position goes, she has stated nothing that suggests that she will do anything different than what Joe Biden does, and that is ongoing unconditional support for Israel. And I mean, just last night, and I'm sure a lot of people who are tuning in right now may have seen this clip, we saw there was Kamala Harris was giving a speech in Michigan at a campaign event, and she was disrupted by pro-Palestine protesters. And, she reacted in a really horribly condescending, rude way. Let's, if we can, please play that clip.
You know what?
Because Layan, I'd like to get your reaction to it.
If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. Otherwise, I'm speaking.
That glare. And, now it's like her campaign, or at least some of her supporters, are trying to be like, oh, she's so badass. Look at that glare. When, these are people who have lost hundreds of their family members in Gaza. And yes, they're interrupting her speech because she is the sitting vice president of the U.S. There's blood on her hands. Sorry, I'm opining here, Layan, but what's your response, A, to her reaction to a protest at one of her campaign events in Michigan, of all places? And then B, how do you respond to people that are like, no, we have to wait and see because Kamala might be movable. Maybe we should support her.
Well, I actually don't think you're opining. I think you're stating the facts. The fact is that she is the current administration, which is carrying out the genocide against the Palestinian people. And the second fact that's important to note is that we don't know what her political program is, actually. If you go on her website, there is no political program. There's nothing actually there's nothing concrete for anyone to actually look at that would suggest any change, whether it's favorable or not favorable to the Palestinian people in Kamala Harris administration. And all we have to go off of actually is the fact that she is the current administration. We're in a Biden-Harris administration, and it's under this administration that the genocide has been carried out. For her to react that way, for me personally, I'm not surprised. And I think it shows very clearly the approach that this campaign is going to take. Palestine has been the biggest political crisis for the Democrats. I mean, it has really destroyed a lot of the Democratic base that they usually can count on. And so the move here seems to me to be to say, listen, if you're for Palestine, don't attack us because Trump is worse. And if you're for Palestine, let's make sure Trump can't get into office. It's another way of kind of trying to avoid the topic. She's not actually commenting necessarily. There's nothing actually that we can refer to that would really give us an idea that she could be movable or not. And I think it's important that we remind everyone and remind ourselves what we have actually to show for is the fact that she is part of this current administration. We haven't seen any sort of policy proposals. We haven't seen her in action. We actually saw a tweet from her team that said under no circumstances would she consider an arms embargo to Israel, and that in fact she is 100% backing Israel's right to self-defense, and that the U.S. would be part of that self-defense. So, it's not a surprise. I think this is going to be one of the maneuvers that the Democratic Party makes to try to get itself out of the trap it's created for itself by not listening to their own constituents' demands around Palestine.
No, I think that's a really important point. And, the other element of this, that tweet that you just referenced there, from her advisor or whatever, saying that she'll stand up to these Iran and Iran-backed groups or whatever the exact phrasing was. But the thing that caught me about that exact phrasing is that's essentially the exact same thing that Benjamin Netanyahu was saying in front of the joint session of Congress, that it's all really about Iran. This is like a plot of Iran against the whole region and against, all that's holy, good, and right in the world, of course, because they're all that's dark, evil, and whatever. I mean, that kind of ridiculous framing by Netanyahu. But it's not that ridiculous because obviously, Israel seems to be going out of its way to inflame tensions with Iran, with other groups in the region from Hezbollah, and to create this sort of good versus evil regional war to, it seems to me, try to reset the stage almost in terms of the narrative of what's happening, even though, of course, it'll mean more death and more destruction. So, I mean, there's no real way to know, I guess, so I'm asking you to maybe just generally speak to it. But it does feel like this is a big strategy of those who are really backing Israel, is to try to create this broader regional polarization centered on Iran, to try to take the issue off of the genocide in Gaza, which is obviously the proximate cause of everything happening.
That's definitely true. And I think it's super complex. It's hard to know what's going to come next. Israel and the United States are extremely nervous, extremely anxious right now. If you look at some of the news and the activity of the State Department and some of the reports on the kind of back channel messaging that's been going on from the State Department to Iran and other states in the region, the U.S. is really quite nervous about the possibility of a regional war. And why wouldn't they be? I mean, there's been no successful war that the United States has carried out in the region for decades. And they tried everything they could to try to put some sort of, tie the bow on the current genocide in Gaza in some way to allow them to move to the so-called day after plan. Now, Israel made a gamble here, and again, we don't know how much the United States supported or didn't support this move, but either way, they are not wavering in their support of Israel. So, in essence, they support the move, made a big gamble with these assassinations. And the assassination of Haniyeh in particular was a huge gamble, and on the territory of Iran as well, in Tehran, is a huge gamble. The response of Hamas has been actually to show greater unity and to appoint Sinwar as the new head of the political bureau. And this is causing Israel to feel very nervous. I mean, if you look at the media coming from the Israeli side, people are really quite anxious. There's a psychological element to all of this. if the assassinations were an attempt to create any sort of deterrence, to create any sort of weakness among the resistance forces in the region, whether it's trying to put strain on the relationship between Hamas and Iran, or between Hamas and the so-called axis of resistance, or to create any sort of internal tension for Hamas by taking out the lead negotiator, who is outside of Gaza. All of those things have failed. I mean, right now it is Israel and the United States who are suffering the consequences of this tension because they are waiting on pins and needles. The ball is kind of in Iran's court and Hezbollah's court, and they're taking their time with it. They're saying, we will respond. We'll respond the way that we see fit, and we'll respond when we see that it's the right moment. It's totally putting the balance of forces has changed completely. And it seems, in a sense, that the US and Israel are in many ways at a disadvantage, even though they are militarily, of course, wealthier, stronger objectively. But this gamble that they took has turned the tables and is now putting them on the side of not knowing what's next, and full of anxiety, not just for those who are in charge of the military establishment, but for the entire population of Israel as well.
Yeah, it's really amazing to just watch how quickly, even though Israel's the obvious aggressor, I mean, they carried out a murder of the head of the ceasefire negotiation team in Iran, in a sovereign country, in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas. And then, of course, they killed the high-level Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in the southern suburb Dahia of Beirut, which is a huge act of escalation. And then you have these Western diplomats rushing over to like anybody they can talk to who can talk to the Iranians and to Hezbollah, being like, just absorb the blow and don't hit back. And then basically framing any retaliation for these obvious crimes of aggression as terrorism. It's just unbelievable to watch, but I guess it's par for the course. But Layan, as we do await this, this Iranian response that is supposed to, come at some point, and of course there's a psychological sort of, warfare element, the fact that it hasn't come yet. I'm just curious, when we talk about, a potential regional war, do you think, as somebody who's been involved in organizing people and protesting constantly against the genocide in Gaza, I mean, do you think there's a level of like fatigue happening around this that, or do you think we'd see an even bigger outpouring of, antagonism towards a potential bigger war that the Israelis are clearly trying to drag the U.S. into? And honestly, like, I don't even know if we should be saying the Israelis trying to drag the U.S., because there are elements of the American ruling class that would love to go to war with Iran.
Well, that's totally true. On that last point, I think that's extremely important to note. The United States is not totally unified on their approach on strategy, nor are they unified with the Israelis, nor is the Israeli establishment unified either. I mean, there's all sorts of different proposals that are coming out from different voices about what's the best route to conquer Gaza, and they're not agreed on this necessarily. But of course, that doesn't mean that they don't feel unity around the project of imperialism in the Arab region. And that's what they're unified on. I mean, the United States still has, there was an Intercept report that came out a few days ago, I think, that showed at least 64 US bases, but a lot of them are secret, or military sites. A lot of them are secret, and so those are what they could uncover. The US still has huge military presence, at least 43,000 troops, I believe, if not more, again, because a lot of the operations and presence is classified or secret. And so it's not like the United States is so unwilling to be there. They've reinforced with more troops in the past 2 weeks. They're making every indication that if regional war does break out, which again, like you said, Rania, the major force that's been escalating has been the Israelis, the U.S. and the Israelis, not the other regional actors, who have been very strategic and actually have showed quite a bit of restraint given the amount of incursions on their sovereignty and attacks that they have been facing. And so on your first question on how the movement would respond to this, I think again and again, the United States has underestimated the level of consciousness of people around the world. Now, it's been almost 10 months of constant genocide, and on the other side of the coin, constant mobilizations against the genocide. Yes, things are going to shift. They're going to go up and down. But what has consistently gone up has been the political consciousness of masses of people who have been participating in this movement. Now, people are no longer going to fall for the whole Iran is bad and everyone else is good scenario. I mean, the process of watching the genocide unfold, of watching the United States justify again and again a genocide, and then the complicity of the entire US system be exposed, has changed the balance of forces for the US to be able to convince its own population of its agenda. I don't think that there will be any less response to a regional war than there is for the genocide, and in fact, possibly more, because people have now their own understanding of the US's role in the world has completely changed, and the legitimacy of the White House's narrative around who is on the good side of history and who's on the bad side of history has completely been thrown away. And on top of it, if we, outside of the movement, the US has lost a lot of legitimacy in the international arena as well. Uh, Even Saudi Arabia is saying that Iran deserves sovereignty and that this assassination was a violation of its sovereignty. A lot of the number one partners of the United States are not indicating that they are in favor of an all-out war along these lines that have been drawn by Israel and the United States. So a regional war, I think, would present a lot more complications for the United States, not just militarily, not just in the arena of geopolitics, but also in the arena of public opinion and its domestic policies. It's no longer so simple to say Iran is bad, we need to defend ourselves from Iran. The whole calculation has changed here, and a new regional war that would implicate more of US resources and that would take more lives from the people across the region, I think would not be accepted by the masses of people in the United States and would create a new political crisis.
Well, a lot to keep watching and a lot to keep following. And as always, we appreciate having you on here, Layan, to help us sort through it all. Layan Fuleihan, Education Director at the People's Forum and editor at 1804 Books. As always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you both so much for having me.